Hello, everyone. I see the participant list is growing. We'll get started in about 2 minutes. Thank you. All right. Good afternoon or good morning, everyone, wherever you are. It's 1 o'clock, so I think in the essence of time, I'm going to begin the presentation. Just a few ground rules. Everyone's audio line is muted. So if you have a question, if you could please just type it over here in the comment box on the left. Just say something like, I have a question in the box, and then Bruce or Bruce Haas is our great host today. We can unmute your line so that you can ask a question. And please feel free to ask a question at any point during the presentation. I'd like this, to be as interactive as possible, so just jump in at any point. I would like to just say at the outset that, I'm bummed I couldn't see people in person at RTP, but I look forward to hopefully seeing some folks next year. I hope everyone's doing well. So my name is Wyatt Boyd. I'm in the Office of Budget. I'm currently the acting staff director for the Resource Planning and Regional Operations staff. I've been at EPA since 2008, all of that in Office of Budget, except for about 6 months that I was on detail to OMB. And I am going to give a presentation today called An Overview of EPA Budget Formulation and Execution. And it has a lot of slides, but I'll cover them fairly quickly to make sure we go over the full set of content. But again, please, anyone, if you have a question, type it into the box. You can just say, call on me, or I have a question, and we'll unmute your line so that folks can speak. Also, if you have any technical problems, please type those into the box. Bruce and I can work that out. So moving to the next slide. Just briefly going to cover the agenda for the presentation. Going to provide a high-level overview of federal budgeting to include the budget calendar, the budget schedule for both formulation and execution, and then do a little bit of a dive into specifics on budget formulation, and then a separate section on execution. And then we'll get to the closing questions, and I'll try at every point to open it up if there are questions. One note is I do have Gary Lane on the call, who's the control team leader in the Office of Budget. My forte is not budget execution per se, so if there's really specific questions, I'll pass the mic to Gary. So all good. And I'll give one last plug. Please, generally, if you want to take a survey to offer feedback, please do so. It helps OCFO in designing these materials for next year. So all good presentations, of course, open with a comic strip. So this is one I liked. It depicts an analyst in the office asking someone, what's the priority of your budget request, and the response is highest of the high. And then the analyst comes back and says, everyone rates their proposal high. And so, what's one thing that's lower priority? And she responds, whatever you're doing. And this is, I think, a nice summation of this idea, right? That budgets are hard. They often require tough choices on where to reduce or where to increase. EPA gets a budget target from the White House Office of Management and Budget that we have to follow in developing our formulated budget. And then we get a final full year appropriation from the Congress. So we have to live within those budgets. And so it often requires many difficult trade-offs. There's a lot of rules, timelines, and deliverables. Budgeting began back in Article 2 of the Constitution that gives Congress the sole ability to make appropriations. There's a lot of budget history. There's a lot of laws and regulations that have built up over the years. And there are, of course, many stakeholders. What interested me getting into budget is that every program, every statute, every priority is going to be accomplished through people and through money. And so budget is a good place to kind of see the breadth of the agency's work. But that does mean there's a lot of stakeholders, and that can be contentious. So the goal of this presentation is to provide an overview from budget planning all the way to closeout, kind of cover everything in between. Moving to the next slide. As I kind of alluded to, federal budgeting generally refers to two parts: budget formulation, budget execution. Formulation, of course, plans for and estimates out-year budgets. So right now, we're beginning to formulate the fiscal year 2022 budget and think about what our request would be to the Office of Management and Budget. And then execution, of course, is once we have funds, once we have budget authority, in our case, loaded into the Compass financial system, making sure that there's the proper accounting of that money, making sure that organizations are using it as provided in our law and as appropriate, following all funds control rules. So right now, of course, we're in fiscal year 2020. We have been since October 1, and we got our full year appropriation December 20th. Before that, we were in a CR. So one challenge we face, right, is to come up with the budget given the uncertainty of future needs. We're in FY20 now, but we're starting to write the budget request for FY 2022. So there's a lot of uncertainty in doing that planning. For example, when we were doing the FY 2020 budget, we could not have predicted that there would be a pandemic, that there would be this emerging issue. So the budget has to account for that uncertainty, which can be difficult. Of course, everything we do in budget is strictly tied to and allowed for by laws and regulations. There's kind of the organic laws of EPA, really the core mission, statutes, the National Environmental Policy Act, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Safe Drinking Water Act. These provide specific authorizations for programs, often includes authorizations for funding. It also provides for either permanent or temporary fee authority. And then, of course, we have our annual appropriations. There's an old saying that's kind of stuck with me that, programs never spent an authorized dollar. Just because it's authorized doesn't mean the money is there. There has to be an appropriation provided by Congress. They do that annually, as well as they will often do supplemental appropriations. This is a really good example this year. As I said, December 20th, we got the full year appropriation for FY 2020. And then about a month later, they reached an agreement on the United States, Mexico, Canada agreement. And Congress appropriated an additional about $304 million for EPA in that. And then we also got some supplemental funding under the CARES Act So this year we've already seen a combination of kind of the regular annual appropriations as well as the supplemental. And then we, of course, have our friends at the Office of Management and Budget. They set administrative law. So like their OMB circulars, A11, preparation, submission, and execution of the budget. A123, management's responsibility. Those are available online. They update them every year. And I find them very useful, one, because they're extremely thorough, but also they're organized by just questions. So you can go to the table of contents in A11 and it'll have a question, you know, what is the congressional justification? What is an appropriation? You can click on it and it'll go to the answer. So it's pretty interesting. And that's built up over decades and decades. They've built up that circular. And that does govern the executive branch. It has the weight of law. So they establish a lot of rules in there. One, of course, is that the budget process for an agency is internal, deliberative. It's embargoed until released. Moving to the next slide. The next category of laws we have, in addition to the annual appropriation, kind of the organic EPA laws, is the government-wide management laws. The Anti-Deficiency Act, you can't record an obligation unless at that time you have budget authority and that amount for that time and purpose. Otherwise, it's a violation of federal law. Doing ADA letters or no fund, that's a letter to the president about it. We have the Government Performance and Results Act, GPRA. It was modernized some years ago, GPRA mod. That establishes the current kind of performance matrix that we use and that we develop the formulated budget in. All programs are tied to annual performance measures, long-term performance goals, what we used to call strategic measures, as well as agency priority goals. And then I won't read through this whole list, but there's FTARA, which establishes the relationship between the CFO's office and the CIO's office to ensure coordination on IT spending, as well as a number of other management acts. And by the way, it's a good place I should stop. I will make these slides available to anyone who's interested. I can share them. I can probably get an attendee list and just share them all at once. But I'll make these available, and certainly if anyone is looking through them and has any additional questions, wants to dive into any particular part, happy to follow up with you. Bottom line, funding the monopoly man, you can't spend money you don't have. It's true in life, certainly true in government. So I talked earlier about the appropriation. That's that's an interesting thing because you have authorizing committees on the Hill and you have appropriations committees. You can certainly have appropriations that effectively serve as the authorization. So they're kind of reauthorizing the program 1 year at a time through the appropriation. And I would say just anecdotally that a majority of EPA programs fall in that category. They haven't been formally reauthorized, but by getting the money every year, Congress is effectively doing that. We have the regular annual appropriation for a full fiscal year. That has two main parts to it. It has the actual bill, the actual public law, and then it has an accompanying report, often a conference report. That conference report can cite or refer to the House report and the Senate report. And so there's a lot of information, a lot of directives, a lot of feedback that Congress gives. Oh, I'm looking at the comments. Post the presentation on SharePoint. Please share slides. Yep. I will share the slides with everyone after this, but they also should be on the OCFO technical training site. But yeah, rest assured, anyone that wants a copy of the presentation, we'll be sure to get that to you. So the appropriation has a lot of rules, and I'll get into that in a little more detail later on. Then there's the supplemental appropriation, sometimes called this an emergency appropriation. We've seen lots of different examples of this over the years, from responding to natural disasters like hurricanes, superstorms like Sandy. We've seen ones to help provide fiscal stimulus to grow the economy, like the Recovery Act, the CARES Act. So Congress can do supplemental appropriations for a variety of reasons. Of course, we have Reimbursable Authority. I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with this. EPA enters an interagency agreement. Maybe it's through a mission assignment with FEMA or with the state, and then we're reimbursed for our work. So the net cost to EPA would be zero. Then, of course, there's the category of settlements. Two big ones come to mind: the Deepwater Horizon settlement, the DERA and AIR, I believe, got a significant amount of money in that, as well as the Volkswagen settlement, where there was the emissions cheating scandal. EPA got some money through that. And then there's the trust funds. Superfund oil and less is the primary example, and then Congress annually must also appropriate these funds before we can actually use them. But the actual financial structure of those are set up as trust funds because of the multi-year nature, somewhat unpredictable nature of the work. For example, cleaning up a very complex Superfund site. The second to last category of EPA sources of funding relates to fees. These must be independently tracked and managed. There's a whole fee branch within OCFO that provides some governance on this. A lot of rules to set up fee accounts to properly track them. And then lastly, there's special accounts, primarily relevant to the Superfund world. If the agency or the government wins a judgment against a PRP, a primary responsible party who's polluted a site, then the legal agreement will stipulate what funds are set aside for what purpose, and we follow that. Let's just monitor if there's any questions. No questions yet. I won't belabor this point about the appropriations, but this just lists the 10 appropriations that EPA has. The largest one, we've actually listed these, I think, based on the size of the appropriation in descending order. State and tribal assistance grants is about 40% of the budget, fluctuates year to year. But, under cooperative federalism, states and counties mainly have primacy for implementing environmental laws. So EPA, certainly not in all cases, but in many. And so we provide a lot of support through grants to states, to tribes, and to localities to implement environmental laws. And then EPM is where about 2/3 of EPA's FTE are funded. It's where a lot of our payroll is. It's really for the core operating of environmental programs and pollution control measures is in EPM. Now, I won't go down the entire list, but we do have, at the conclusion of the presentation, I'll be sharing some resources that you could use as a reference if you wanted to dig deeper into what the specific purpose of an appropriation is, what the authorized uses are. I have some references for that. Of course, you would always want to check with the appropriate people. I know Allison Holden did a great appropriations law training. There's a whole field in the proper use of appropriations. One really important point is that in our appropriations, EPA does not have transfer authority, so we cannot move funds across appropriations. There's two exceptions to that. There's a transfer of Superfund money into ORD for science work that supports Superfund sites, as well as there's a IG transfer also to support Superfund. Those are expressly called out in the bill that we have transfer authority. Otherwise, we cannot, across these 10 lines here, we cannot move $1 across any of those appropriations. That would be inconsistent with the law. That's not true of all agencies. Some agencies, like I know Homeland Security, do have some limited transfer authority, Department of Defense. So just providing an overview on some budget formulation products. What are we talking about? What is budget formulation? You've probably seen it if you've looked at the Office of Management and Budget submission that we submit usually the second Monday of September. That then turns into a multi-month process working with Omb to develop the president's budget, which is supported by the CJ, the Congressional Justification. And then we work with you, work with the whole community to develop a lot of supporting materials, the budget in brief, which I have a copy of with me right now. It condenses that 1,200-page CJ into about 100 pages And that's what most of the general public reads, I think, when they read our budget. Then, of course, we have hearings every year with the administrator in front of typically two authorizing committees, the SEPW and the HEC, House Energy Committee, as well as the Senate and House Appropriations subcommittees for Interior and EPA. We do a lot of prep for that, working with the community. After the hearings, we'll get questions for the record, where we have to answer in writing things that came out of the budget hearings. And then we have to clear those all through OMB. They stay in the record forever. You could go back to the Library of Congress and read through the QFRs from the 1975 EPA budget process if you wanted to. Kind of interesting, I guess. Then reporting requirements. If you've read the report, conference report that accompanies our bill, you'll see that they often use the appropriations process as a way to ask for things that Congress wants. They want to report on endocrine disruptors, or they want to meet and talk about our FTE targets and our plan to reach them. And they put that all in there. The reporting requirements, we treat them as law, and we work with our partner offices and programs, regions across the agency to fulfill those. Then, of course, we get lots of questions from Congress, OMB. All decisions have to flow up to the appropriate senior leader for budget. That's the CFO and the administrator. And many more fun things we work out in budget formulation. So, getting into a little more detail about the schedule, I have two kind of interactive slides I'm about to share that illustrates just what is the budget calendar? What do we do every year? And I would just note that one thing about budget is that I've learned, at least anecdotally, is that no 2 years are alike. In FY19, we got our appropriation in February. In FY20, we got it in December. And so you think you're planning for things, and there's always some uncertainty as to when there's going to be action. And most CJs and president's budgets are submitted in February. I think at least one year we submitted it in, I want to say, late April, because the White House was working to do a tax deal that was going to change the deficit projections. And so we didn't get our OMB guidance until they reached that tax deal. So the PB was delayed. So this is a general calendar. I will say every year can be unique. So here's about 18 months listed on the left-hand side here. It's nice because we're in this June timeframe, so we're kind of at the beginning of where this calendar starts right now. And so we expect as an agency in the next couple weeks to get a memo that's signed by the director of the Office of Management and Budget, telling agencies, hey, here's your budget target for FY 2022. And that's usually not written as a number. It's usually written as a % change from the FY 2022 target that they published in the last budget. So if you go dig up the 2021 president's budget, you can see a 10-year forecast of lots of different things, including for every executive branch agency. You could look at EPA's FY 2022 target in there, and then OMB might say you're 5% below that target, or you're 5% above that target. And then we go and we calculate what that is, and we confirm with OMB that we got the exact right number. Then there's a bunch of internal planning discussions with senior leaders, with the SBO, the regional comptroller community, and their staffs. Those are all internal planning discussions. I'm going to get into this in a little more detail later on, so I won't spend too much time on it. But that all results in decisions and guidance on what's going to be in the budget that will allow us to live within OMB's target. And we submit the budget to Office of Management and Budget in September. Then, right about the time the holidays are picking up, right about the Tuesday after Thanksgiving, that's also when the budget season starts really heating up. We get about a 30, 40-page document back. And I see there's a little bit of sound troubles, but Bruce is dealing with that. Thank you, Bruce. So we get this pass-back document, and it's OMB and the OMB examiner's reaction to our OMB submission. So they'll not unusually plus us up in some areas where we didn't request it, maybe to reflect a priority of the White House, the administration. Certainly see that a lot. I remember the year we got passed back and there was $300 million added for the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. That we did not include that in the Omb submission, but the White House said this is a priority, we're doing this, and it's been a program project ever since. So the passback is a very intense time because we only have 72 hours to respond to it with a signed letter from the administrator. So we have to digest it, brief up, get those decisions out to the appropriate people all within a few days. Once we respond to that passback, we then usually take about a couple weeks to reach settlement with OMB. So at the detailed level, at the fund program project level, we agree on every change with OMB. There's a lot of negotiation happening at that point. That settlement then becomes the basis for the president's budget, the congressional justification. Once we develop that congressional justification, I would just give a, it seems like people are losing sound, which is a bummer. I'm just talking into the chart. Okay, Allison says she can still hear. Okay, good. Seems like sound is coming back miraculously. Okay, thank you, Dan. So then once we submit that to the Congress, they will proceed to, I was going to give a plug for Ghoul and Stephanie, and I think Joey are giving a presentation on how to write persuasive program project fact sheets. So I just give a plug for that. That supports the CJ. So then I think the 1974 Budget Empowerment Act, something like that, established the modern federal budget process where you have budget committees that set, they pass budget resolutions saying, you know, this is the amount of spending that can occur based on revenue. And then the full appropriations committee give allocations to the subcommittees. There's 12 appropriation subcommittees. EPA has one that also covers Department of Interior. They then go through a whole process on both the House and Senate side, doing subcommittee markups, full committee markups that go into the floor, and then House and Senate often will pass different laws, so they have to go into conference, and it has to be signed by the president. That's just kicking off right now. I think our appropriations subcommittees are just starting to look at markup for FY 2021. So a lot of work there. You can usually follow that on the internet. They'll post their drafts when they pass a markup. You can usually find it online on their website. Certainly the Office of Budget, we track that very closely. And then, as I already mentioned, we have the appropriations hearing. The last section here is the president signs the budget into law once Congress has reached an agreement. And that's where we get the budget authority. Of course, we have to develop an operating plan. I'll get to that in a minute. And once we have that authority, then we make sure that we implement all those laws that I covered, all those federal government management and budget laws. And that is where it changes from budget formulation to budget execution. Once we have that appropriation, once we legally have the budget authority, now we're executing those funds, and we've kind of shifted from planning to implementation. I'm not going to go over this next slide here very much. This is all of this previous slide's information just presented concurrently. So it overlaps all of them. You can see, you know, if you were to pick like the May-June timeframe, right now we're planning for FY 2022. The budget year is the one we submitted the president's budget on. You'll sometimes see that referred to in like MAX or other places as the BY. And then you have the CY, the current year, which is the one we're implementing, FY 2020. And then you have prior fiscal years where maybe we're outlaying obligated funds, we're making sure that funds aren't expiring, we're reviewing to assure proper expenditure, deobligation of funds. And there's a series of funds control trainings that Angel Robinson and Gary's group offers. So they certainly go into a lot more detail on that. So these two calendars are really the same thing, just presented differently. So what's happening now? FY 2022, like I said, we put a call out about a week ago for multi-year plans so we can collect ideas for agency priorities. And that's not an open call. We have a a senior leaders planning meeting where we get guidance ultimately from the administrator on what areas he or she would like to see developed into budget proposals. And so right now in FY22, we're kind of in that brainstorming mode where we're gathering ideas of what might we include in the Omb submission. For FY 2021, we got the president's budget released in February. We concluded all of the hearings, and now we're doing two main things. I think finishing some final questions for the record, clearing those through Omb, as well as potentially providing some technical assistance to the Hill on the FY 2021 markup. That's something that every agency tends to do. They have a congressional liaison. If we get asked questions by the Hill, we'll answer them. FY 2020, of course, the end of June marks the end of the third quarter of the fiscal year. So we're moving right along, monitoring those funds very carefully. At EPA, we centrally manage payroll. And so we work in OB and OCFO very closely with the regional offices, with the national programs to manage their payroll. But there's also grants management going on, contracts management going on all across the agency in FY 2020. And then, of course, FY19, we're managing those funds, doing funds control. And at the conclusion of this presentation, I'll have some kind of key dates on that. We might begin some closeout related functions. So the whole purpose of this slide is just to, one, I guess, show pretty pictures of beaches and forests, which would be nice to be at right now. But also just to show you how dynamic budget is. And that's why I found it interesting these last 12 years, is that you're always using multiple parts of your brain. You're planning kind of big future ideas, but you're also implementing a lot of technical details on the ground. It's never a dull moment in budget. So what to look for in each budget cycle? What can you expect, even with all that variability I talked about? What's kind of tried and true, always there? OCFO will issue guidance every budget cycle, whether it's the Omb submission, the CJ, an interim op plan if we're operating under a CR, the final operating plan if we got a full year appropriation. You can pretty much guarantee that we will be issuing two sets of guidance for each one of those processes. One will be a policy guidance, usually signed out by the CFO to the administrator, assistant administrators, regional administrators, providing kind of a higher level update on resource decisions, on where funds will be allocated. And then Office of Budget and our sister office, the Office of Planning, Analysis, and Accountability, those directors will sign out technical guidance, which really gives the budget community, the resource community, the details they need to do the resource data entry in BFS and to really develop the budget in the compressed timeframes that we have to. So look for that every year. Oh, Linda lost sound once again. That's a bummer. Thank you, Bruce, for working on that. And then one kind of unique memo is after the operating plan is loaded into Compass, Office of Budget will issue the Advice of Allowance. This formally communicates all of the directives, all of the rules that are in our appropriations that we have to follow. It's a very large guidance, maybe 50 pages. It has all of the controls in it. Generally, EPA cannot move the lesser of 10% or $1 million into or out of program areas. But Congress stipulates a lot more controls at the program project level, even sometimes at the sub-program project level. They do that by calling them out in their report, the tables in their report. So the Advice of Allowance communicates all of those things. So definitely recommend reading that very closely every year. It has a lot of valuable information, a lot of valuable control charts in it. So that's just a high-level overview of the process. Now I'm going to move into budget formulation. I'm about halfway through the presentation at this point. I don't see any questions that are at least pertaining to the presentation, some technical questions about audio. But just again, if anyone has any questions, please just say, raise your hand figuratively in the chat box. I'll be sure to call on you. So this, I don't think you can hear it. But the slide got stuck. That slide there had an audio feature. It's playing a song. I don't think it goes to the Adobe. There's playing Here Comes the Sun, because it's the summer, and I've covered a lot of this. OMB will issue us guidance with the top line resource target for EPA. The budget, of course, and this was established, I think, with the OCFO Act as well as with GIPRA. We have to integrate budget and performance, right? And that the budget is always written within the framework of the strategic plan, so that we're right now in the FY 2018 to FY 2022 EPA strategic plan. That lays out kind of the why. Why are we spending this money? Well, it's to achieve these objectives, to have clean air, clean water, clean land, et cetera. And it builds out specific performance targets. OPA, the community, do a lot of hard work through the NPM guidances, and it's a whole world of its own performance. But the budget is integrated with that. And certainly if you've seen a CJ or an Omb submission, you can see how we tether every fact sheet to performance results. Also, under the rubric of the summer budget process, the SLC, the Senior Leadership Council, which consists of the top political as well as career leadership of the agency, will meet typically once or twice over the summer to deliberate on the budget and provide input ultimately for the administrator to make decisions on what's in the budget. So that's kind of where we're at right now. We're right at that phase. And then in late July, after all these discussions, OCFO will brief out to the administrator, give those decisions, and then, like I said, we'll issue out the guidance that documents those decisions. Next slide. As part of the budget formulation process, sorry, someone was just calling me. We've instituted, since I think it was the fall of 2018 when we first did it, we've instituted the MYPs, the multi-year plans. And the idea here was, I think that leadership saw, whether it was in the operating plan or in the pass-back process where we have 72 hours, there's often really significant decisions that have to be made in very short, compressed timeframes. And so we were thinking about, how do we get ahead of that? How do we have kind of decisions or input from leadership where we have the time to really deliberate on it, to work with the community, to refine the proposals, to get a lot of detail. We're not just rushing through decisions because of deadlines. And so that's really the genesis of the multi-year planning process, where we gather typically a proposal that covers 5 years. So the ones right now would be for like FY 2021 to FY 2025, and what's kind of the minimum maximum resources that would be necessary for that plan. And that really gives us a lot of flexibility if in the operating plan or something we have a little bit of money available, we have a little bit of flexibility, we already have a list that's been deliberated on by leaders, and we can go to that, and it helps us tee up decisions and get informed decisions a lot more efficiently. Last year for the 21 President's Budget, I guess it was only about 4 months ago we submitted that, feels like a year ago. There were 8 proposals included in the President's Budget, and I was quite pleased with that because there were 8 MYPs included in the OMB submission. So we actually got all 8 of the multi-year plans in the OMB submission approved by OMB and ultimately to the Hill. And those include things like reducing ocean pollution and plastic, reducing food waste, some IT-related proposals, and those are highlighted in the budget. So, like I said, we're doing another round right now for pre-selected lists, not open season, but there's we're updating about 20 or so plans right now, and the process will continue. So, moving on to the next slide. I'll go through these pretty quickly because I kind of hit on them in the schedule. In early September, we'll submit the OMB submission. It's about 1,000 pages long. This one is not open to the public, whereas the CJ is, posted on EPA.gov. You can go read that. But it's in the same format as the CJ, but it is internal deliberative because we need the White House's approval to develop and submit it to Congress. Once we submit that, there will be about a dozen OMB hearings where OMB leadership will meet with NPM leadership, go through that NPM's proposal in detail. They'll ask a lot of follow-on questions. The water examiner will have some questions for the water program. That's all them basically gathering information to help support their pass back and to help them arrive at decisions on what they are or are not going to recommend supporting in the passback. And they do a whole director's review process over there where the examiners brief up to the OMB director, get decisions on what should be in passback. So that's often the genesis for a lot of those questions. This had a gobble sound effect on it for the turkey up here. I also don't think that goes to the Adobe, but it was a good gobble. As I mentioned, for the OMB passback process, we have a very compressed window to get a letter back from the administrator, basically outlining any concerns that the agency wants to, thank you, Clay, wants to identify. If in the letter, if EPA doesn't flag it as an issue, if we don't put it in the administrator's letter, it's treated as settled. So the letter really puts a marker down for these are all the areas we want to keep talking to OMB about, we have potential issues with. Negotiations then really kick off in earnest for a couple of weeks after passback, and then hopefully by like mid-December, we've reached settlement on every dollar, every tenth of an FTE, and then we can get that guidance out, usually right about Christmas. And then we move into the really working with the community on developing the CJ materials. Next slide. EPA, along with every federal agency, releases the president's budget on the same day. It's usually about the second week of February. That's actually in law, but as I alluded to, sometimes OMB will change that to reflect current events. And agency senior leaders will be called to testify once that's released. We often will get a few hundred questions for the record that we have to work closely with regional and NPM offices on, depending on the nature of the question. And this, again, all goes back to this idea, and if you've watched the appropriations hearings, you see that they often have this written right on the chairperson's dais. No money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations. So Congress will review that CJ, and then provide us our final appropriation. So once that happens, once we get the appropriation, we move into the second major component of federal budgeting, which is budget execution. So I'm just looking at the chat box right now. I don't see any questions. So please don't be shy. If you have any, just dive in, and then at the end, I'll have an open period as well for questions. And I started out in Office of Budget as a media analyst, and then I went over to the planning team, and now I'm acting as our staff director. I definitely kind of came up in the budget formulation world. I'm newer to budget execution, but learning something every day, and it's its own world. If you have very specific questions, of course, I have Gary, the control team leader, on the line. So this is these three separate diagrams illustrate the various components, high-level components of budget authority. Of course, we have to have the appropriation, or in some cases, if it's like a permanent fee or something, we have to have the authorization, like FIPRA comes to mind. And that's where Congress passes the bill, signed by the president, we get a public law. They all say if you take appropriations law training, time, purpose, amount. An appropriation always has an amount of budget authority that can be used over a certain period of time. For EPA, that's usually either 2 years or no year money. Those are the most common buckets. And then a purpose. And you don't want a violation of any of those, or you'll get a potential Anti-Deficiency Act. And then also with statutory authority, OMB has statutory authority to do apportionments. So once we've gotten the appropriation, developed the operating plan, submitted that plan to Congress, then we'll go to OMB and we'll request an apportionment. And that's basically for every account, every fee account, every appropriation. We have to get clearance through OMB, and that can include a rate in it. So it could say, you can only spend X amount of this appropriation over this period of time. It can allow OMB kind of to control the money to some extent. And that's set out in a public law, and it's just meant to establish good financial controls over money to ensure the most efficient, productive use. And then lastly, EPA will provide that budget authority to an allocation or an allowance to allowance holders through the financial system. When we load it into Compass, we load it down to that allowance holder level. And those are really the regions or the major offices at headquarters that have the authority then to obligate against that budget authority. Okay, moving right along. Some federal spending terms you'll hear in the context of budget execution is commitment, obligation, recording of the obligation, and outlay. Kind of working backwards, that's kind of how I think. I think we're all familiar with an outlay. That's when EPA actually makes the payment. The money's out the door, so to speak. Recording of an obligation is when we note in the financial system that the agency and the government have assumed a liability. And of course, we track obligations very closely in the system, a lot of funds control there. And then what that obligation represents is the point at which there is a legal obligation or a definite liability that the agency has assumed to pay money for something, a good or a service. And so there's a legal obligation at that point, and deobligation is its own separate process. That's separate from a commitment, where it's kind of a reservation of funds. It's almost like a planning feature, but it doesn't have yet that legal weight. We could remove a commitment without changing a legal obligation. And I know there's probably a lot of people. I see 124 people on the line. There's a lot of people that have a lot more information on funds control than I do. So I see a question: how do you see this in Compass? Well, you can see it in Compass, or you can see it in the budget formulation system. You can go into BFS, for example, and see the nightly actuals. You can see the final actuals for a given month or a given year. And then, of course, you can run various reports in Compass and Seaboard's reporting arm to get at that. That's really a whole separate training about how to actually access that. I think we know CFO would be happy to provide additional training on that. And there's periodic training provided by OCFO on Compass and BFS. Tanya asks, is it recorded? Can I get the recording later? Yep, this has been recording since 1 o'clock, and we can share that with you. Dorothy asks, who is the allowance holder? That varies by RPIO. So there's RPIO is the Responsible Planning and Implementation Officer. So region and MPMs are all RPIOs. Often there'll be just very few allowance holders in the region, maybe like one. And at headquarters offices, though, there might be several allowance holders within an office, like Office of Air and Radiation. They have Office of Transportation and Air Quality as an allowance holder, Office of Radiation and Indoor Air allowance holder. So those are major components that have kind of the authority to enter into obligations to actually utilize the funds. And how do you get access to BFS? So Office of Budget controls access to BFS. I believe you can go to bfs.epa.gov and you can follow the instructions there. Ultimately, the Office of Budget has to approve that access. You can also contact someone on the systems team within Office of Budget. All right, I think I got all the questions. Thank you for those questions. Time check, 1:47. So, of course, we have an EOR graphic for operating under a CR, which is, come October 1st, EPA's, prior fiscal year appropriation is no longer, has run out, essentially. So we either need a continuing resolution or we need a full year appropriation. Absent that, we have a lapse in appropriations and we enter into a shutdown. There have been 2 significant shutdowns in the last about 6 years. So I'm sure some people are familiar with that. We lose that appropriation, we lose the ability to spend money on those programs. That's not true in all cases. Some programs can continue to operate, but that's very select based on their different authorities. A CR notably will not be typically written in a dollar amount. It doesn't say, oh, EPA has $1 billion to operate for 2 more months or something. It's usually just written to an amount of time. So, this is a continuing resolution through December 1st, 2020. And then we do the math and we say, okay, that's 62 days. So programs operate at a rate of operations of, get 62 3/65ths of the last year's budget. So it really continues the rate of spending of the previous year. Of course, very important to remember that a continuing resolution is kind of like just a continue, as the name implies, a continuation of the previous year. So you can't do reorganizations, you can't start new programs, you can't really spend any differently than we did the year before unless you get an anomaly that's approved through the White House Office of Management and Budget and then passed by the Congress. So a very important principle. A CR is generally a time that we're very conservative in the budget community. Next is when we get the actual enactment. And this EPA has been required for as long as I've been around to develop an operating plan. If you look at other appropriations bills, not all agencies have to develop an operating plan. A lot of them do. For EPA, we typically have 30 days to develop an operating plan and submit that to the Hill. And that is really a detailed plan by fund, program, project of how we're going to allocate the appropriation, of course, following all the congressional controls. So the law will break out every appropriation amount. You get X billion for STAG. It'll break out every program area. And then after program area, it gets a bit inconsistent. The law will break out some program projects, but certainly not every program project. It'll even sometimes break out sub-program projects. It'll say you need to put this amount towards Energy Star. And so whatever Congress calls out, we have to make sure that we're supporting that amount. But also we need to fill in all the details. All the program projects where they didn't stipulate an amount, we have to go back and tell them in the operating plan, okay, this is how much we plan to spend on every program project in EPM, every program project in S&T. And then, of course, that becomes the basis for what's loaded into the Compass system. We do that process, of course, by at the very fine level of detail in the budget formulation system, which requires that we do it at the level 8, the organization level. So it's very, very detailed. It's loaded in Compass at the allowance holder level and not the org level. And that's a very intense period of time developing the operating plan, because in addition to following all the rules that Congress gives us, we also every year we'll review our FTE levels. We'll go check with the administrator about if there's any FTE adjustments that need to be made, and then we need to make sure that we're funding any of those FTE adjustments. So Allison asked a question. The operating plan isn't in document form, right? It's just part of Compass. The operating plan is technically a memo that the CFO will send to the chair and the ranking member of our Senate and House appropriations subcommittees. So the actual plan is a document that we send up, and it has this year it included a breakout of fund, program, project funding, as well as FTE levels, because they asked for that in the report. That's the actual plan that we submit after 30 days. And then the BFS version that really allowed us to produce that guidance, that memo, that BFS version is the enacted budget that then we translate into the op plan when we load it into Compass. If that answers the question at all. Memo on the SharePoint site. No, that is not on the SharePoint site, but I could certainly, if you're curious, Allison, I could share a copy with you. You're welcome, of course. Lily's typing. How long does it take for Omb to review and approve the op plan? That's a good question. We, in a typical op plan calendar, we have 5 days that they have to either comment on it or clear it. So, and they don't allow any less. It's at least 5 days. Yep, plans reviewed and approved by Omb. So I was saying earlier that a really important part of the operating plan, of course, is setting that payroll. So I know some folks on the line have probably participated in some payroll meetings you've been having with OCFO. Payroll is essential, obviously, to pay our people to accomplish the mission from a very large standpoint, but also because payroll belongs to the agency, unobligated carryover will kind of come back to the agency for priorities. So we spend a lot of time in developing the operating plan trying to get the payroll as accurate as possible. And we do that through taking a payroll snapshot in the Compass financial system. But that's a whole other presentation. There could be a whole other presentation on that. But suffice it to say, we pay a lot of attention to trying to get payroll right. So just to circle back, kind of a little knowledge check. The appropriators, once they've received the agency's operating plan, we must receive an apportionment from OMB. Once we have that, we'll complete the budget load, let the community know, and then the appropriate obligating officials can begin spending that money, and payroll can start, every pay period can start hitting against that budget authority. And then, of course, about 30 days after we transmit the operating plan, we aim to get out the Advice of Allowance, which is just a great desk reference for any FCO, any budget person. Often, if you have a question, you can find the answer in the Advice of Allowance. All right, I'm on slide 28. I only think I have a couple more to go. We're at 154. So this kind of builds out the answer to the question that was asked earlier about who's an allowance holder, what's an allowance holder. They're people that actually manage the use of funds, whether they be for grants and contracts, manage payroll and hiring. They begin committing the funds. They manage obligations and unliquidated obligations, getting those funds properly expensed. OCFO, largely through the budget formulation and control staff, which I'm not a part of. OCFO regularly, daily monitors those commitments and obligations and making sure that there's appropriate and responsible utilization of funds. Because, of course, I think we have 7 years from the point of obligation to outlay funds. And then, of course, we have, if it's like EPM, we have 2 years in which we can obligate the funds. Otherwise, they expire and we don't get to use them. So obviously, we don't want to, lose a single dollar appropriated to us. So managing those funds, regularly monitoring them is critical. And I believe this just happened in early summer. OCFO and OMS will jointly issue, Office of Budget, Office of Grants Department, Office of Acquisition Solutions will release a joint closeout memo that has all the specifics on the deadlines for grants, contracts, interagency agreements, and procedures on how we'll sweep the money or take it back if they're not obligated, because we want to make sure that they're used. So I'm just going to do a plug here for some closeout dates, and I believe these were already communicated in the memo, but on funds control, the sweeps of old commitments has begun. It's well underway, May 29th. The last day for new commitments with expiring funds is right around the corner, June 30th. Last day for travel obligations, July 2nd. And then for expiring funds, the sweep of available balances above 5,000 will begin July 20th. And then the last day to sign obligation documents for the carryover funds for the BBFY 2019-2020 funds is August 31st. And of course, if you want specifics on that, I'd refer you to the closeout memo or to a member of the control team. This slide is what I referenced earlier as far as useful references if you are looking to dive into what is an appropriation used for. And of course, this doesn't replace any specific guidance. It doesn't mean that you should just do whatever's in here without checking with the appropriate people, but it's good references. EPA has been developing a funds control manual for a number of years. We're working to clear it through OMB. That's a pretty comprehensive document about the processes, roles, and responsibility for funds control at EPA. I'm optimistic that's hopefully close to being finalized. As I've said, Advice of Allowance is a useful reference. The object class manual describes in detail how financial managers should use each of EPA's object classes. There's BOCs Of course, payroll is one, travel is one, and there's FOCs that roll up to that. Oh, we got a couple questions. Oh, thank you, Gary. Sweat funds are pulled up and used for, So Edna asked what happens to sweat funds, and Gary answers that sweat funds are pulled up and used for agency end of year priorities. So the idea being there that the agency wants to ensure that these funds are used. So OCFO will sweep them and then with leadership approval, use them for appropriate end of year priorities. And then of course, there's the program project description book, which we got a question last year about updating this. I'm happy to report that OB is currently updating the program project description book. That used to be in Bass. Bass is now retired. I hope it's enjoying its retirement, well deserved. And there will be another iteration of the program project description book. I think we'll have more to share on that in the coming months. That's a very useful reference if you want to look up a specific program and see what purposes funds are used for in that program. And then lastly, the CJ, every year that's posted online. We post that the day the budget's released in February. And then, of course, the committee or conference reports will often help fill in a lot of details about congressional intent of an appropriation. So just a slide that summarizes useful references out there. And it's 159, and I've reached at 159 the concluding slides of we're here to help. OCFO is a support office, so we're here to support you. Whether, every program will have contacts in the control team, we'll have a meeting analyst contact. We're here to help. Please reach out to us anytime. I see a question. How often is object class manual updated? I don't know the answer to that for sure. I think periodically, every few years, it's looked at whether it actually warrants an update. Object classes don't change year to year, but it is periodically reviewed. Last version I saw was FY17. And then here are some contacts within the Office of Budget. You, of course, may have others in your program. I'm currently acting RPROS director. My permanent job is as the planning team leader. Angel is the staff director for the budget formulation and control staff. Gary is the team leader for the control team. We're very fortunate to have Andrew Cardenas as acting operations team leader in RPROS. So these are some references. Feel free to contact us at any point. And it's 2 o'clock on the nose. I know we've been taking questions throughout, but just one last call if anyone has questions. I see participants have dropped down. Are there any final questions for me? Oh, you're welcome, Clay. Cool. Well, it was a pleasure. I hope to see folks, in person a lot more next year. I hope everyone's staying safe. And be well. If you think of any questions, feel free to reach out. Thank you so much, everyone.